Greetings, everyone. Welcome back from lunch. I hope you are all full but not fed up. So this panel kind of neatly ties into the panel we had before the break, because the question of the agent of development is a fraught question. There was a moment when the developmental state was seen as the primary agent of social transformation. And down the line, it became maligned as the bloated state, the neo-patrimonial state, the corrupt state. So the question really is, how do we imagine those debates at the abstract level, but if we move concretely to what was achieved and what is possible going forward, what kinds of questions are we going to ask? Now, we have a number of papers for this panel. I will not read the extensive bios. They are in the program. What I will do, rather, is to introduce the speakers as they present. You will notice a slight change in the order of presentation, and it is to deal with the exigencies of presenting online. One of our colleagues is online, and we don't want to keep him waiting in the event that the network disappoints us. So I will quickly move to the third presenter, who will be the first presenter, and that is Professor Ken Ochieng Opalo, who is Associate Professor of Political Science, Georgetown University, Washington, D.C. His paper is on the political economy of industrial policy in Africa, the case of Kenya. Professor, you have 20 minutes, and if you do 15, we'll be grateful. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. I'm sorry I could not be there in person because of
recording in progress.
Family reasons. I had to stay in DC, but I must say that I am super grateful to Grieve for organizing this conference. Both of us are huge fans of Thandika, and I hope that we can build on this and get more analysis of his work and to make his work ever more popular in academia. Okay, so in my 15 to 20 minutes, I'll quickly try to think through Kenya's industrial policy with some attention to Thandika's own work. So the motivation for this paper is basically thinking about Kenya's attempts to industrialize. Kenya has had broad-based industrial policy focusing mostly on the agricultural and manufacturing sectors, although the manufacturing sector got a lot of attention for most of the 70s and 90s, and also more recently in the government's attempt to spur industrialization. So the overall policy direction can be classified into two broad periods. The first one was the import substitution era. This is basically from independence to 1986, where the government attempted to do import substitution industrialization with lots of tariffs, quantity quotas, and other measures geared towards protecting would-be Kenyan industries. This policy worked for a while, produced a decent amount of growth, although most of that growth was actually driven by agricultural exports. But eventually it collapsed because of the collapse of the East African Common Market, which was a big market for Kenya's industrialization drive. Of course, the economic shocks of the 80s, political change in Kenya, and sort of the decline in belief that the state was the best way to direct development, as we all know. Then, after that came the export-oriented industrialization era, which really happened under structural adjustment by the IMF. Hence, perhaps some of its failures to succeed, because instead of being a growth strategy, right, this policy was mostly implemented as a stabilization strategy. So, liberalization, getting rid of exchange rates, getting rid of non-tariff barriers, etc. And so since then, the government has tried multiple times to spur export-oriented industrialization with some successes in some sectors like textiles and horticulture, but mostly failures with regard to having a broad-based industrial growth. Okay, and you see this in the data in the sense that for much of the 80s, after the end of import substitution industrialization, you see this sort of decline in the in the share of manufacturing in GDP. The spikes in the 90s are a function of GDP contraction. The spikes in the 2000s are real, but as you can see, they were very short-lived. And GDP as a share of total output, industrial manufacturing as a share of total output has been declining since. I'm not sure if this blip is sustainable. Meanwhile, the employment share in the sector has been rising. One interpretation here is that the sector is actually getting less productive from a labor perspective. So labor productivity is declining in the sector, a lot more people going in, while the sector is contributing ever smaller shares of GDP. So what explains the variation that we see in industrial policy, but also in its effectiveness? I'll try to make the case that three factors are at play here. One is changes in political and economic property rights. Basically, over the last 60 years, industrial policy has worked best when it was politically safe for the incumbent regime to allow for private sector development that's anchored on Kenyan or politically implicated Kenyans owning property in the sector. And when that wasn't true, then presidents found ways to make up for the gaps. And that then distorted the sorts of policies that they were willing to tolerate. I also make the case that, prior decisions about who gets to be core to the industrialization drive then shaped subsequent policy sets of feasible policies. The other big factor here is that industrial policy, as you can imagine, has worked best when it was targeted at specific sectors or even farms, as opposed to distributed policies that were done as part of a reform era, which is to say that you see a lot of success in targeted policies in the 60s and 70s, less so in the 80s when industrial policy was done as part of a general reform agenda, which by construction, was meant to not be targeted at anything. Then beginning in the early 90s, you also saw some successes when the Moi administration was more targeted in its policies. I think textiles and horticulture are good examples of successes of targeted policies as opposed to just general reforms. And then, of course, the variation in the external environment sort of limits the extent to which government policy can actually spark growth because you need an external market. If the global economy is not doing so well, it's hard for governments to work around that if the whole plan is to have export-oriented growth. Okay, how do I go about this? Mostly process tracing, looking at policies, and then doing intertemporal comparative analyses using both quantitative and qualitative data. And the focus here is mostly on farm growth as well as employment. Today, I'll present mostly data on farm growth. So main contributions here are to illustrate that path dependence shapes what policies subsequent governments can implement. I think Kenya shows that the fact that at the beginning, industrial policy was focused on mostly agricultural-led manufacturing and exports, limited the feasible set of alternatives of policies that was available in the 80s and 90s. Most of the industrial output in the earlier eras were joint ventures with foreign firms that when economic times got hard, basically left the country, meaning that the country had very limited options to build upon. And then at the same time, the interaction between domestic and external factors shaped the content of policies, which is to say that, low-income countries like Kenya at the time don't always have the luxury of making policies under the best conditions. Okay, what's the conceptual framework here? I think Thandika's work on the developmentalist state is absolutely spot on. And I'll pick on three factors that I think he got very, very well in the famous developmentalist state paper. So one is, this question of ideology. Do African governments ever really want to develop? And I think he was right in the sense that yes, politicians may be corrupt. Yes, politicians may be short-termist. But many politicians also have this desire to see progress, material progress, and often have elaborate ideas about how to go about that. And so throughout Kenya's history, in the Kenyatta era, the Moi era, and in the multi-party era, the very elaborate developmentalist ideas that are used to legitimate the state, but also to motivate elite level investments in the economy. On the question of capacity, I think Thandika was also spot on. So, of course, the paper is in reaction to arguments that, the African developmentalist state is not a possibility because it lacks ideology or capacity. But he makes the case that, all you have to do is be good enough, right? And that, rent seeking or state capture policies can actually work in favor of industrial policies in the sense that in low-income country contexts, the idea that a free market can spark growth is impossible, and instead it makes sense that farms would only take the risk if the government assures them to gain maximum profits from the investments. And so in this world, the idea of targeted policymaking ceases to be viewed purely as rent-seeking or state capture, but rather deliberate effort to guarantee the property rights for those who take risks. And then, of course, there was also the other side of this argument, which is that belief that the African state has this pathology of being too big or too corrupt, both of which are not true if you look at the comparative data, then led to the maladjustment of the African state, which ended up really weakening this state. So here, the question of capacity should be viewed through the lens of, is a government or a state strong enough to get going on the developmental path, rather than, is it perfect before it can engineer growth? And then finally, I think Thandika also did a very good job of reminding us that we often judge African countries on an unfair scale, in the sense that if you look at the 80s, we tend to forget about the external factors and how much they mattered in shaping economic performance in the region. Leave alone the fact that these countries were barely 20 years old when the crisis of the 80s hit them. Right. And now with hindsight, we can see that the older they've become, the better they've been able to withstand shocks. Right. So African states, for example, have done much better than the 80s, weathering the 2008 financial crisis, the COVID crisis, and even the debt crisis that we're going through right now. It's nowhere near as bad as it was in the 80s. And so having a comparative perspective I think is useful for understanding, the possibility of the idea of the African developmentalist state. Okay, so applying this to the Kenyan case, as I said, works rather well, with some kinks here and there. I think on ideology, you can see that in the Kenyatta era, it was elites working together to promote growth. It was an exclusive elite. There was a definite attempt to indigenize the Kenyan economy, to buy land from departing British colonialists, to limit South Asian ownership of the economy through both laws and political coercion. And a deliberate effort by the government to give credit to African bureaucratic elites, not just politicians, but bureaucratic elites, to be sort of the fountains of accumulation within the African elite class. So, which is to say that this wasn't just, a smash and grab exercise, right? There was some deliberate thought into the process. After Kenyatta, beginning in the early 80s, Moi was largely redistributive in the sense that the Kenyatta era had produced a very concentrated sort of pattern of wealth within mostly central Kenyan elites. And so Moi wanted to redistribute access to benefits in the economy, which again also structured his approach to policymaking. And then lastly, the last 30 or so years have been, an era of what I can only call reformitis, which is, this habit of constantly looking for, the next magic reform that will spur industrialization. At the same time, capacity in Kenya has varied quite a bit, but it has always been good enough, in my view. So while reform have failed to sort of spur broad-based industrialization, there have been pockets of excellence here and there. The tea sector, the coffee sector, textiles, as I mentioned, more recently, telecoms, and digital products have been islands of success within this state.
Professor, you have 5 minutes plus.
Yes. All right, and so this is what I think I view as sort of the lesson that we can take from Kenya, looking at Thandika's work, and this is just a summary of all of that. So looking at Kenya, I'll show you a couple graphs here towards the end. One way to view sort of this long history is that the choices made from the beginning to concentrate power in the center. What I'm showing you here is a graph of both revenue collection and expenditures at the subnational level. And this is important because for a brief period after independence, subnational units in Kenya were able to collect revenue and actually engage in a lot of investments in public goods and services. The Kenyatta administration systematically centralized revenue collection and spending, and thereby reduced their share of spending at the subnational level, which is to say it concentrated policymaking at the center. This limited the capacity of the state to develop in a way that was not centralized and therefore prone to failures at the center. Moi, as I said, tried to redistribute, and you see this in the 80s when the subnational share actually attempts to go up. That did not work well because at the end he ran out of money and time because he had to democratize. And it's since 2013, you've seen this return to subnational spending for development, among other things. Unfortunately, the revenue has not been decentralized, revenue collection. This means that subnational units in Kenya don't have the incentive to engage in developmentalist sort of approaches to policymaking because they don't stand to gain the revenue. Right, so the centralization that happened in the 60s and 70s still lives on with what is now just decentralization of expenditure, but not of revenue collection. This matters because developmentalist policymaking necessarily has to be decentralized, so that different parts of the country can try different things instead of having a central approach. Because a central approach will typically get hijacked by the ascendant coalitions. So that, under Kenyatta, again, indigenization was the leading sort of game at the center. Under Moi, it was redistribution and crisis of general reforms without specific attention to any specific sectors. Under Kibaki, the ascendant coalition was a finance coalition. So, the Kibaki era was good for the Kenyan economy in terms of reforms. But if you look under the bonnet, the main sector that really benefited under Kibaki was the financial sector. Which then impose constraints on, the dream of manufacturing, because the financial sector and trade, meaning imports and exports, were the leading ways in which the members of the elite coalition made money. That translated into the Kenyatta era as well, which actually saw a lot more hyper-financialization of the Kenyan economy, whereby banks and insurance companies and other financial companies were the ones making most of the money in the economy, with very little attention paid to manufacturing. The Ruto era is trying to rejig this because the financialization of the growth story in Kenya has caused quite a bit of imbalance in the economy. But I'm not sure how far they will go in sort of bringing back the idea that agricultural-led exports should be the backbone of the economy, and on top of that, have some manufacturing. And you see this again in the question of farms, whereby the liberalization era begins basically in the late Kenyatta era with the crisis of the 80s. Kibaki tried to build some SOEs, most of these tied to universities, but that did not last long. The indigenization drive that I talked about was very evident in the 60s and 70s with the growth of African-owned farms being the main core of the economy as Kenyatta built his base of elite supporters.
Professor, can you please
then,
round up in the next 1.5 minutes?
Yes, this is the last slide. And so the other thing that I should note is that politics really played a role here, right? What you notice here is that the registration of new farms was pretty subdued for a very long time. And it's only in the Kibaki era where the government really opened up to new farm registrations. And so this also had a bearing on growth because if you can't register farms, people can't take risks. It suggests that the government has their thumb on the till, especially if you contrast it with the fact that, for foreign-owned farms, the government was ever willing to allow them to enter the economy. So politics meant that only specific types of people could register domestically owned farms, while foreign farms had a free rein in the economy. I'll stop there. Sorry to have had to rush through this, but looking forward to Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you. Please join me in appreciating our professor. So we will move to the next presentation, which is by Professor Dionne, Associate Professor of Political Science, University of California, Riverside. And the presentation is on how state investment in public health shapes perceptions and well-being in Africa.
Thank you so much. Oh, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank Grieve Chelwa for inviting me to be part of this fantastic group of talks, and to the Africa Institute for putting together this wonderful conference. So you'll see the title of my talk has changed since I originally submitted an abstract. I'm really focusing this talk on Malawi, and trying to understand how state spending matters for health services and health outcomes. This is part of a bigger question that I ask in my work, and that question is, does it matter how much governments spend on health, and how can politics shape health outcomes? These are questions I've been interested in for a long time. I'm not sure I have the answers yet to this, so today I'm just going to pose some interesting things I've learned over time, and I'll start actually by talking about how Prof. Mkandawire's work affects me and my work. So I unfortunately did not have the pleasure of meeting him in person. We were mutual follows on Twitter, and it was actually through following him from afar and his commentary on the political economy of development in Africa that I learned more about his work, because unfortunately for me, I went to a graduate program that did not assign his excellent scholarship. And so it was through this kind of later stage that I came to know his work and appreciate a lot of the key arguments that he made, including I think something that really resonated for me, and that was when we think about development, we shouldn't just be relying on economic indicators like GDP growth, right? That we should be thinking about development broadly, right? And this is in a greater tradition, I think, like, Walter Rodney, right? Like, what does development mean? And so one of the things I took away from Thandika Mkandawire's work is thinking about social transformation, and I've been troubling figuring out what that means, including from the last panel. What do we think about? What is social transformation? What does it look like? So my goals in the talk today is just kind of talk through the logic of government health spending, patterns in health spending in Malawi, and then linking that spending to actual health outcomes. Let me just, I'm sure I don't have to explain Malawi to many of you here in the audience, but some of the key things to understand before we get into a discussion about health and health outcomes based on health spending is to just think about, this is a population-dense country. It's quite, 20 million people estimated to live there, many of them young. And half of Malawians live below the national poverty line. It's an agrarian economy, right? A lot of people rely on subsistence agriculture, and that production is actually not enough for people to meet their basic needs. A lot of children are stunted in Malawi, and people are going without enough food to eat and without the sufficient medical care that they need, based on nationally representative survey samples conducted by Afrobarometer. And if you look, I always hate this slide when I'm with people who don't understand African development, because they're like, oh yeah, it's like the last line in every New York Times article is like, and half of the population lives below the poverty line. It's like, yeah, but why is that? And another thing that I really appreciate about Thandika Mkandawire's work is that it tries to remind you of the global structure in which this poverty is occurring. And this is, I don't know if any of you have read 1,000 Cuts, a recent book published by Alexander Kentikelenis and Thomas Stubbs, where they actually look at IMF conditionality. And if you look at this map, the darker countries are the ones that have the most conditions. Malawi is 12th out of all countries in the world for the sheer number of IMF loan conditions that they were subjected to. And what really troubles me about this is I talk to my friends in Malawi, and some of them are a bit nostalgic about the dictatorship era and how, certain things were better. And I'm like, oh yeah, but it was a dictatorship, don't you love democracy? Isn't democracy great? And they're like, the buses ran on time, and there were actual civil servants. And if you actually look at the civil service in the periods before, let's not say before democracy, but before structural adjustment programs required these austerity measures, they actually had a very efficient, honest, not bloated civil service in Malawi, but structural adjustment programs, because of this kind of monocropping idea where, one size fits all, just retrench the civil service, these severe conditions put put upon Malawi by the IMF and other international financial institutions leads to a contraction of the civil service, including the civil service that's providing healthcare. So if we take a step back from Malawi and just think kind of generally why governments spend on health, the existing literature in, particularly in political science, but also in political economy, the argument is democratization is good for health. Because when you extend the franchise to more people, you have to provide more public services to those people so that they then reward you with bringing you back to office, right? So there's this idea that, more democratization leads to greater provision of public services. And in Latin America in particular, we see that when leftist parties are in power, they actually spend more on these public services because it's consistent with their values of equality and solidarity. And even in my own work, there's not everything about democracy leads us to greater investment in health. In fact, if you look in particular at spending on health and contributions to various programming related to health, it's actually autocratic governments that spend more on health, at least in this period in the early 90s and in the 1990s and early aughts. And that's because the autocrats know they're going to be in power a long time, so they might have longer time horizons and might therefore be willing to invest in something like health that they don't realize the benefits of except for much later into the future. So this is why some governments might spend on health, and there's some guidelines about how much they should be spending. And one estimate is that it should be about $42 per capita in a low-income country, just for everyone in the country to be able to get a baseline standard of primary care, this would include things like immunizations, rapid testing of prominent and prevalent diseases, and labor and delivery services for pregnant people. So here's a chart of how much health expenditure there's been in Malawi, and you can see there's only 2 years where Malawi has met this baseline $42 per capita. And those are just in very recent times when, in fact, it's probably the estimate should go up. And this is all health spending. This is not just the government. This is government spending, external financing, out-of-pocket expenses of ordinary Malawians who are trying to stay healthy. So how much of that is actually coming from the state? So the state here is the blue line, and external financing is the red line. So this is a share of how much of health spending is coming from the domestic government, and it hasn't been the leader in health spending since 2002. Right, it's been really driven by external financing, whether through aid or through loans. And so what we're seeing here is a pretty severe dependence on external financing for something as essential as the health of the population. And, we have to put into context, the government's competing priorities, right? So one of the major issues in Malawi is not just high poverty, but low food security, right? So in Marian's presentation earlier, we learned about the fertilizer input subsidy program, right? This was a program that was started against the IMF's wishes, right, to try to make the population more food secure. I will also say to try to get Bingu wa Mutharika reelected when he had an opposition legislature, so Marian and I could talk more about that later. But, in a time where your population is hungry, right, an immediate need is to try to ensure that they meet those basic needs, and doing a fertilizer input subsidy program may actually be cheaper in the short run and something you can actually do when there's competitive elections. because it's a coupon you hand out to a person, they remember that. It's very different than whether or not a hospital was open and a doctor was present and there were materials and medicines there for you when you were sick. And especially as the perception that health is provided or supported or financed by external donors, there's not the same accountability for whether or not there's excellent health care, that you don't direct line that to the president. But if the president and his party gives out coupons for fertilizer, you can give them credit for when that works, when there's good rain and your fertilizer is effective. And the international financing of health follows bureaucratic budget expectations. So when I finished my dissertation fieldwork in Malawi, I presented to a group of development stakeholders, let's call them. And what was interesting to me was one of the key findings from my dissertation work was that HIV/AIDS was not a priority among ordinary Malawians who were navigating the AIDS pandemic, that there were other more pressing issues like food security and access to clean water. And all of the international development bureaucrats who were in this room hearing me give that talk was like, well, we have all these budgets to spend on HIV/AIDS. So can we just put like a red ribbon on a borehole and that will solve these problems? And what I took away from that was, so much of even, international stakeholders who are invested in doing something about health, they have their own business cycles. They have their own pressures to spend money in specific ways. Okay, so now that we have how do people spend, does the spending even matter? So existing research is mixed, but there's not a consensus that health spending leads to improved health outcomes. If there is an impact, it's, quote, quite small, and other things tend to matter more, whether, how high a state's income is, the distribution of that income within the population, whether women are educated, whether there's ethno-linguistic difference in the country, and the size of the Muslim population, that will largely explain differences in child and infant mortality between countries, right? So these are widely used measures of health outcomes. And in Malawi, a couple of economists have found that, in fact, increased health spending is associated with decreases in child mortality, but not if perceptions of corruption are high, right? So if we understand perceptions of corruption to be indicative of actual levels of corruption, that increased health spending actually can improve health outcomes in Malawi, so long as there's not a lot of corruption happening. Okay, so if you'll recall, health spending in Malawi has gone up over time. In this same time frame, looking at the number of healthcare workers, we're not seeing the same kind of steady increase. There were more nurses and doctors in 2018 and 2020. But that's gone down again. There's not like a steady increase. So that this increase in funding for health has not led to a steady increase in healthcare workers. Using Afrobarometer data on how citizens evaluate their government in improving basic health services, also mixed. Not tied at all to the amount of spending, it seems. Things looked to be pretty good until after 2012, we see a reverse. People are saying things are going badly. Now, there's some really interesting research out of South Africa that Dionne and Evan Lieberman have done that could be explaining what's happening here, that maybe access to health services improved and people felt entitled to good service, and then they realized they were not getting good service. So even if access improved, their perceptions of the quality of that service had gone down, and so that may be some of what's happening here. I looked at Afrobarometer data on whether people reported paying a bribe to get medical care, and that, for most people, that's never, right? Even in the year where it's the biggest problem, right? The most recent year for which there are data in 2022, 87% of Malawians say they've never paid a bribe. But the number that have paid a bribe, right, 14% in 2019, 13.3% in 2022, that's double, more than double what it was the first time they asked this question in 2012. So it's not a large problem, but it is a problem that has been increasing. And this is the last graph I'll show you, I promise, then you can wake back up again. Okay, so this to me is the most telling graph of what's happening. And so if you look at the timeline, we're going 1980 to 2021, okay? 1980 to 1990, the death rate is pretty steady. And then what happens in 1990? Audience. HIV. So the death rate goes up pretty significantly, right? And in 2000, we start to see it go down. And some of this is because the HIV rate has peaked in 1999, 2000. And so, we see things like behavior change and also just kind of some elements of how HIV travels in a population. But you see a pretty steep decline after 2004. And that's because of the introduction of antiretroviral therapy. This is not curative, but transformative treatment for people who are HIV positive to live longer, healthier lives. And so the death rate declines precipitously and keeps declining until when? 2020. And what happens then? COVID-19, right? So what's fascinating to me about this graph is that the biggest changes are international pandemics and a really serious increase in funding to get people medicines they need to lengthen their lives. So for me, the takeaway from this graph is that health spending does matter. We see that through the spending that happened to increase people's access to life-lengthening drugs. It's also competing with things that are outside of the government's control, right? Governments can't really control international pandemics, right? So these disease pandemics, there's only so much one can do, and I think that's, one of the things I'm trying to think about as I work through this, as I'm, trying to grapple with this. And the last thing I'll say is, the reason why I'm trying to look at these graphs and look at these data is because another thing that I learned from Thandika Mkandawire is that we really have to look at a long period of empirical realities and not a truncated small window version without understanding kind of this bigger context. And I think that helps us to get a sense of what's happening and what things can actually be influenced by the government and what can't be. So thank you for your time and attention. I look forward to your questions.
Please, another round of applause for the professor. Not least for saving 18 seconds. So if you look at the program, the next presentation is Africapitalism as a Distraction from Structural Transformation. The presenter is Faisal Garba, and Faisal happens to be the moderator and the discussant. So what we'll do is we'll go to the last presentation, and depending on how we're doing with time, I can decide to say ditto. Whatever Ndongo said would have been my presentation. We end or I present. So the next presenter will be Ndongo Sambasila. Ndongo's presentation will be titled, or is titled, The Economist as a Hunter of Western Myths and Pathologizing Constructs, on Mkandawire's contribution to African political economy. Ndongo is the Director of Research for the International Development Economics Associate Ideas, International Ideas, a very important counter movement in terms of the battle of ideas around policy space on the continent. Ndongo, over to you.
I would like first to thank the Africa Institute for hosting this great conference on a giant of African economic thought, and also for having me here. I'm really happy to be part of this conference. And I would like to pay a special thank you to Prof. Shalwa, my friend Prof. Shalwa. I will start my talk with a quote from German sociologist Norbert Elias. He said, scientifically thinking groups are generally groups which criticize or reject the dominant and commonly accepted ideas of their society, even when these are upheld by recognized authorities, for they have found that they do not correspond to the observable facts. In other words, scientists are destroyers of myths. I think this quote is an apt description of the scholarship of economist Thandika Mkandawire. Indeed, throughout his prolific career, Thandika embraced the vocation of a myth hunter and destroyer. The former CODESRIA executive secretary worked extensively on social sciences, academic freedoms, and the role of intellectuals in Africa. He contributed on issues such as employment, land, real transitions, colonial legacies in tax structures and welfare regimes, etc. As a true mark of his multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary proclivities, he ventured into the field of political science, studying topics such as democracy and democratization trends, the violence against peasants by rebel movements, etc. However, the bulk of his work revolved around the political economy of development, development being understood as a growth in administrative and industrial capacity leading to structural economic transformation. A vigilant observer of trends and fads in development thinking, Thandika worked hard to not only debunk myths and pathologizing constructs about the African continent, but also to provide alternative accounts that offer a better understanding of its political economy. One can rightly say that Thandika set a kind of a gold standard when it comes to social science research on Africa. His numerous academic essays against a variety of sloppy Africanist writings are a testimony to that. His dedication to have African voice on all topics that matter to the continent helped to build international epistemic communities, to deliver innovative research outputs, and more generally to strengthen African social sciences. As someone who had been victim of the violence and arbitrariness of the government of his home country, which constrained him to a long exile, Thandika has been paradoxically the greatest defender of the African state against the various attacks coming from culturalist, mainstream economics, neoliberal, and dependency theory-inspired accounts. While he argued that African state was not pathological or no more pathological than elsewhere, he strongly emphasized that structural adjustment programs undermine its administrative and fiscal capacity and divorce it from its developmentalist vocation. He tirelessly documented the limitations and disastrous effects of the neoliberal policies of stabilization, liberalization, and privatization imposed by the Bretton Woods institutions on the continent from the 1980s to the early 2000s, and which paved the way to what he subjectively called the African Great Depression. Thandika challenged the idea that developmental states, for various reasons, would be an impossibility in Africa. He convincingly refuted claims along those lines by the neo-patrimonialist school. Better, he made the point that the 1960s to the mid-1970s was generally a period where many African governments articulated developmentalist projects, even if they had not been ultimately successful. Yet, Thandika's monumental contribution to African political economy did not really confront the ultimate myth, what Brazilian economist Celso Furtado called the myth of economic development, the belief that the populations in the global south can one day enjoy the standards of living of those in the global north. This catch-up view ignores or downplays two important historical facts. First, the development of the global north has been based on the net appropriation of global south resources. Second, the living standards in the global north are based on levels of consumption and waste of resources that could simply not be produced elsewhere without precipitating the collapse of human civilization. Thandika's powerful analysis and plea for developmental states seems to be premised on the possibility of economic catch-up at the periphery of the global system. This belief or presupposition is probably the major point of departure between Mkandawire economics and the scholarship of radical economic thinkers such as Samir Amin, who had a more pessimistic view about the economic transformation that global south countries and their large labor reserves could enjoy under capitalism. What could African countries, in their variety and diverse determinations, could objectively achieve under capitalism? Thandika's answer to this question has been largely ambiguous. He somewhat believed that genuine progress can be achieved under capitalism. Africa could industrialize and achieve social transformation. He insisted on the critical importance of social policy as a development tool to that end. While Thandika argued that developmental states are possible in Africa, he did not really detail what accounts for their success or failure. He went further and argued that democratic developmental states are desirable and should be possible. Here again, he did not specify under which condition they emerge and what the suffix democratic exactly means and what possible trade-offs would be implied when developmental states become democratic. So Thandika left us with a difficult task that has to be possibly completed. As he himself declared during an interview, quote, "The great intellectual challenge for Africa is how to create democratic developmental states that can address the material needs of citizens in ways that are socially inclusive," end of quote. In what follows, I would like to revisit, interrogate, and expand, and possibly strengthen Thandika's developmental state approach. My conversation with him will be articulated around 5 points: imperialism and the developmental state, the list of African developmental states in the pre-neoliberal period identified by Thandika himself, the utopia of democratic developmental states, the developmental states and the ecological question, the developmental states, and the agenda of full and decent employment. Developmental states and imperialism. Thandika had an open-minded relationship with Marxism, dependency theory, and structuralism. He didn't hesitate to use their arguments when they seemed valid to him, and also to question them when they seemed unfounded. He did not share their pessimism about the development prospects of the countries of the South within the frameworks of capitalism. Indeed, what these different traditions have in common is their emphasis on phenomena such as imperialism, neocolonialism, comprador classes, etc., which are accused of blocking or distorting economic accumulation in the periphery. Thandika was an anti-colonial activist at an early age and a fervent Pan-Africanist throughout his life. Yet what makes his work singular to some extent is the under-theorization of imperialism. Thandika did not give a central place to how the territorial and military logic of central countries, as well as the capitalist logic of their corporations, shaped particular economic outcomes at the periphery. Obviously, he did not ignore all these aspects. I would speculate that he chose to focus his efforts on debunking incapacitating cliches about the African state and African development. The voluntaristic or idealistic trends in its sort mirror his temper. He described himself as essentially and always very upbeat about Africa. The sophisticated thinker he was always looked for policy-making options that could deliver African development. The under-theorization of imperialism by Thandika can be seen in his conceptualization of the developmental state. In his past briefing 2001 article on the developmental state, Thandika lumped together the literature on neopatrimonialism and the one which describes the African state as neocolonial or dependent. In his view, all these perspectives fail to consider the autonomy of the African state and ultimately its developmentalist potential. Thandika's insistence on the structure-ideology nexus contrasts with his silence on the external conditions that do or do not favor the successful pursuit of developmentalist orientations in Africa. The development experiences of East Asian countries such as Japan, South Korea, Taiwan have provided the empirical material for the developmental state literature. Thandika was strongly influenced by these and other cases. However, what is not emphasized enough in the case of these model countries is that they were strong allies of the United States in the context of the Cold War. Without minimizing the importance of the astute policies these countries deployed, the fact is that they also benefited from exceptionally favorable external conditions, leading some of us, such as Emanuel Wallerstein, to speak of development by invitation. Take South Korea, for example. This country experienced tremendous economic progress under military rule from the early 1960s until the 1980s. From the mid-1950s to the early 1980s, South Korea recorded chronic merchandise trade deficits, but it was able to mitigate them as well as the current account deficits with a surplus in trade services, a surplus that corresponded to payment for military services to the United States, which also granted it substantial aid. South Korea experienced debt crisis, but these were not as disastrous as those experienced by most of the third world countries between the 1980s and 2000. For late industrializers and model developmental states such as South Korea and Taiwan, Vishay Prasad pointed out in one of his books that the investment as aid they receive, quote, dwarfs the aid that went to the rest of the third world from both the United States and the USSR, end of quote. And, quote, because most of these East Asian and South Asian countries enjoy the security umbrella created by the United States, they spent much less than they might have on their militaries, end of quote. These contextual elements justify, in my opinion, why it is no doubt problematic to think that South Korea type of developmental states are easily transposable elsewhere. To be a little provocative, I would say that one of the reasons why the African continent had an economic trajectory different to Asia in the post-independence period is that we did not have a regional industrial hegemon like Japan, who facilitated to some extent the economic development of its neighbors and even paid them reparations and other forms of compensation for its colonial and war crimes. Nor did we have the equivalents of North Korea and China, those credible communist and military threats that allowed the empire to bank on a strategy of development by invitation. Instead, we often had leaders that cared more for their own class interests and those of their imperial masters. Those who really cared for the development of their countries were often not allowed the opportunity to stay longer in power or were rather isolated. At least in Francophone Africa, this has been the dominant pattern. African developmental states before neoliberalism. To refute the thesis of the impossibility of developmental states in Africa, Thandika suggested that developmental states existed in the continent in the period before the advent of neoliberalism. He offered the following evidence. Between 1967 and 1980, of the 27 countries with the highest GDP growth rate in the world, 10 were African. These 10 countries, he argued, were developmentalist because they recorded GDP growth rates of at least 6% on average per annum over this period. However, this criterion for identifying developmental states is ad hoc and inconsistent with his own theoretical framework. Developmental states generally recorded high economic growth rates over a number of decades. However, not all countries that have achieved high rates of economic growth can be described as developmentalist. To assess whether some country qualify as developmentalist, several indicators need to be used alongside the economic growth rate. For example, it would be necessary to examine whether their government really pursued developmentalist policies, whether their developmental strategy was sustained over the long run, and whether it led to significant structural changes. Otherwise, we might have some surprises, such as the claim by one political scientist that the Belgian colonization of Congo saw the emergence of the developmental state in its late phase. Thandika ranked Côte d'Ivoire, Gabon, and the Republic of Congo among the top 5 African developmental states in the period 1967-1980, alongside Botswana and Lesotho. This is a very counterintuitive and surprising viewpoint for researchers interested in French-speaking Africa. For a part, their vast natural resources, which they have not used for the benefit of their peoples. The main thing these three forms of French colonies have in common is that they continue to be clear examples of neocolonialism. Until now, these countries have never had any control over their natural resources and economic policy instruments. For example, they use the CFA franc, a colonial-era bond currency still under the legal tutelage of the French treasury and whose external value is determined by the evolution of the French currency to which it is pegged without any consideration for their external trade competitiveness. In the case of Eastern and Southeastern Asian countries, a competitive exchange rate and credit management policies were major ingredients of their policy mix, instruments which were never mobilized in the case of the three countries. In the case of Gabon, the Omar Bongo regime did not favor investment in higher education, as it shared the view visible in the writings of right-wing political scientist Samuel Huntington that more educated people in the South could be a source of political instability. Even if there were some economic improvements compared to the colonial period in the three countries, the growth recorded was for the most part to the benefit of metropolitan interests and the bureaucratic elite. What's more, it was fragile and unsustainable. In his book, Neocolonialism in West Africa, written at the end of the 1960s, Samir Amin convincingly and presciently showed that the so-called iron miracle was putative and was soon to evaporate. He described Côte d'Ivoire as a country marked by its strong reliance on foreign private capital, its allegiance to France, and its rejection of any political type of Pan-African integration. Samir Amin argued, quote, "The type of growth which Ivory Coast has experienced since the 1950s does not therefore result automatically in an economic takeoff, but rather in increased foreign dependence and the stopping of growth." And that's what happened. Côte d'Ivoire achieved its best level of real GDP per capita in 1978, and since then, the country has not caught up with that level, and it's the same pattern for Gabon and Congo. The point here is not that developmental states are an impossible reality, but rather that one cannot use the rate of economic growth to assess which states are or have been developmental. Thandika's list of African developmental states pose another problem symptomatic of the under-theorization of imperialism in his work. African countries that have not had a run with the West are overrepresented, while some interesting experiences of delinking are not evoked and discussed. For example, the case of Burkina Faso under Thomas Sankara offers some useful lessons. During his 4-year reign, the country made appreciable progress despite an unfavorable regional and international context and limited economic resources. Similarly, Libya under Gaddafi, whatever one might think of Gaddafi, was arguably the most socially advanced country on the continent. Before its invasion and destruction by NATO, the United States, France, and the United Kingdom, Libya led the continent in terms of the UNDP's Human Development Index. Libya was certainly not an industrial country, but the nationalization of oil made the country financially self-sufficient and enabled social progress not seen in other oil and resource-rich African countries, such as Gabon, which Thandika included among the developmental states. The developmental states and the democratic question. While acknowledging that developmental states were almost without exceptions regimes that deviated from liberal democracy, Thandika tended to think that political authoritarianism was not an essential characteristic of developmental states. He hoped that a new vintage of developmental states would emerge and would be democratic. The experience of the Nordic countries and those of African countries such as Botswana and Mauritius reinforced his conviction. In principle, developmental states should enjoy relative autonomy from potentially antagonistic social interests. To promote national economic development, developmental states must discipline both capital and labor. Disciplining labor has often required repressive measures on the part of the state. The question is therefore, can a capitalist developmental strategy really afford the luxury of a democratic developmental state? The answer to this question obviously depends in part on what is meant by democracy. If democracy is taken to be synonymous with liberal democracy, which is the dominant understanding, I would tend to think that a democratic developmental state is conceivable in theory in the South. But in this case, another question arises. What about the risk that more political liberalism plays into the hands of forces of the status quo that stand in the way of the desired structural transformation? An intense propaganda campaign has convinced many that liberal democracy is a regime of the civilized, by the civilized, for the civilized. It would be the most appropriate form of government to achieve the objectives desired by the people, or at least it would be the least worst of all. But the history of economic facts leads to a more nuanced view. I'll take 2 examples to illustrate this. Let's start with experiments in eradicating extreme poverty. Taiwan, Hong Kong, and South Korea achieved this goal despite being ruled by so-called illiberal regimes, in contrast to countries considered in the 1960s to be among the best democracies in the South, such as India, Costa Rica, Jamaica, the Philippines, and Sri Lanka. Botswana, which has always remained a liberal democracy, recorded the highest average economic growth rate in the world over the period 1961-1990. However, despite its small population, Botswana has still not succeeded in eradicating extreme poverty. As a UNICEF report underlined, in 2022, the share of the population living in extreme poverty stands at 13.5%, and is over 4 times higher than predicted by Botswana's GDP per capita and compared to countries with similar income levels. Second example, income and wealth inequality in Africa. South Africa, Botswana, and Namibia are among the best liberal democracies on the continent. At the same time, income and wealth inequalities in these countries are shocking and are far greater than those observed in countries such as Angola and Equatorial Guinea, which are considered kleptocracies by some Africanist literature. Inequalities in access to land are a major determinant of the vast economic inequalities in Southern Africa. Yet, it seems unlikely that the spontaneous operation of the so-called rule of law will lead to significant land redistribution in these countries. According to political scientist Michael Albertus, 80% of land redistributions worldwide since the end of the 19th century happened under dictatorships. On the rare occasions, what he called dictatorships, on the rare occasions when liberal democratic countries have tried it, the scale has been small. Albertus explains the situation by arguing that a liberal democratic regime is built on checks and balances that powerful landowners can instrumentalize to maintain the status quo. Albertus wrote, quote, "Institutional constraints in most of the world's new democracies have given elites more than a just foothold in government to slow or water down land redistribution. They have given them a platform on which to strangle it," end of quote. These 2 sets of examples confirm a general point made by Joseph Schumpeter in his classic Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. Quote, "Both the will of the people and the good of the people may be, and in many historical circumstances, have been served just as well or better by governments that could not be described as democratic according to any accepted usage of the term," end of quote. To prevent any misunderstanding, the discussion so far has not been that political authoritarianism is a necessity for economic development, nor that democracy is undesirable. Like Thandika, I believe that democracy has intrinsic value, but I don't think that so-called liberal democracy is democratic and can bring about the structural transformation to which most of the global South aspires. It is important to remind that the political system we nowadays call liberal democracy was named elective aristocracy, bourgeois government, and republic in the 19th century by its proponents who oppose it to the idea of democracy as a government of the people by the people themselves. My point of view is therefore more of an invitation to move away from the sterile, propagandistic, and elusive dichotomy between so-called liberal democracy and so-called authoritarian regimes, and also to highlight how difficult it is for the countries of the global South to reconcile political stability, significant structural transformation, and substantive democracy. So far, the functioning of the global capitalist system has not enabled any country in the South to achieve these three important objectives together. In the case of those struggling against imperialism, nervous and edgy forms of statism have been the norm. As a result, political stability and, where possible, structural transformation have often taken precedence over the democratic control of the state and the economy by the people. The democratic developmental state idea is a beautiful utopia worth pursuing. However, it is unlikely to materialize under capitalism and without some form of popular revolution. Indeed, a developmental state that institutionalizes substantive political participation by the masses, subordinates the organization of the economy to them, and ensures equitable economic outcomes is likely to be a post-capitalist and anti-capitalist society. In the neoliberal period, as Thandika himself pointed out, what he called choiceless democracy created a growing gap between popular aspirations and how the economic system is managed. I will not have the time to talk about the ecological question and the labor question, but I want to conclude by saying that these are the kind of issues I wanted to constructively engage by building on the work of Thandika Mkandawire, whom I met for the first time, more than 10 years ago in Dakar, during a Codessia General Assembly. He chaired a panel where I was involved in. I was allowed 10 minutes, but he kindly allowed me to speak for 2 or 3 more minutes. My talk was about the historical evolution of the concept of democracy since its invention, 50th century BC, and how it had been hijacked by bourgeois modernity. When I finished my presentation, he approvingly told me, "Nice deconstruction." I guess if he were here today, he would probably not agree with some of my points, but he would certainly appreciate engagement with his work. Thanks for your attention.
Yeah, another round of applause for Dr. Samba. So we have about 47 minutes. I propose to take 60 minutes to do my presentation and the role of the discussant, and then we can use 31 minutes for question and answer, and then we go for break. Okay, so my presentation is a question, really, and it's titled, Africapitalism as a Distraction from Structural Transformation. So, I think an important thread in the works of Thandika Mkandawire, his writings, his efforts at building institutions like Codessia and so on, but also the kinds of political struggles that he engaged in, mainly the battle of ideas, really center around Africa's future, its place in the world, and the salience of Africa's intellectual production. So just before the end of his long and very productive life, Thandika was advocating for the need to build clusters of excellence in training the next generation of African scholars. So he kind of proposed regional clusters of excellence, that take on important subject matters and train students around those areas. Now, this imperative, I think, partly emerged out of Thandika having witnessed the systematic erosion of the capacity of African institutions to produce liberatory knowledge. And the economics departments were a major target of this intervention. So often what happens, if you think of the Chicago School and what they did in Chile, you take a particular moment of crisis and instrumentalize it. So what happened was at the tail end of structural adjustment, economics departments were targeted where students graduating with first class, often got scholarships for, capacity development initiatives or to go study in particular programs. And this is linked with a network of journalists and quote-unquote think tanks. There's this thing called think tank. Right? Often they say these are empty tanks. They don't do much thinking. So the idea is you have this symbiotic relationship, between people who've been trained and are in faculty, but also journalists and think tanks. And I think Mkandawire and his generation were at the heart of the fight back against this, beginning with a very important book that he published with Charles Soludo, our continent, our future, and then African voices on structural adjustment, but also other interventions. Now, I think in doing this, Mkandawire and the progressive collectives around Codestria, Austria, and so on, put forward an alternative. And that alternative is the need for an urgent or a different structural shift in African economies and societies. Now, this shift is different from the shift advocated by structural adjustment, which is really the continuation of the commodity dependence, shrinkage of the public spending, and also taking over the very idea of the commons, from education to resources. And this is where I think this question of structural transformation is important in the way in which I understand Thandika to be advocating it. So beyond a leap in terms of the productive capacity, moving from labor-based, labor-intensive forms of production to more high-tech that have qualitatively different forms of output, but it's also about how one shifts the reality of African economies, which are characterized by a disarticulation and an enclave economy, which has very little to do with the real economy and the productive sectors of the economy. But this language of transformation has been co-opted lately by an interesting class of African billionaires. And this is led by one very rich Nigerian called Tony Elumelu. So Tony Elumelu, through his Elumelu Foundation, has put together what initially came out as a gem of thought, Africapitalism, but this has been systematized by scholars working at the University of Edinburgh Business School. So the idea really is that, and it's not a thoughtless proposition. In a sense, they make an important critique of the structural barriers that African economies face, but also that even emerging but also established African capitalists face, in terms of barriers that other states impose on them, but also questions around discrimination, based on racial discrimination and issues around gender. So what they're trying to do is to put forward what, in their view, is an attempt to have a tripod that pushes back against the extractivism that classical colonial capitalism and its variants post-independence have been driving on the continent, but also one which puts, if you like, an embedded liberalism with an African face to embedded liberalism. And they have 8 principles that they believe will drive this Africapitalism. So the first is entrepreneurship. So you create a class of successful enterprises that are Africa-owned, long-term investment, and this is a critique of, again, this short-term extractivist orientation that transnational capital has had towards Africa, taking over strategic sectors, what used to be called the commanding heights of the economy, mining, and so on, value-added growth, so beneficiation instead of just this primary export dependence, you kind of try and add value, development dividends, so economic and social benefits for societies, making sure that this thing called social responsiveness is more systematically organized, and regional connectivity. One of the major problems on the continent is at times if you want to travel, say, from Accra to Sahrawi Republic, for example, you have to go to Turkey. So you need a network of low-cost airlines, railways that ensure mobility of trade goods, but also ideas. Shared purpose, so business, government, civil society, community, academia should come together and think of a minimal program. And multi-generational development, so investment that takes seriously the aspirations of future generations, not one which is only concerned with the present. Now, increasingly, these ideas really are beginning to be active in certain sectors of the policy space in West Africa. And these principles, I don't think, are nonsensical. I think they do make sense in terms of the diagnosis of the problem. But then the question that I ask is this a manifesto for some kind of Ubuntu exploitation? Exploitation with an African face. And because the reality is that if we say contemporary capitalism alienates, exploits, dehumanizes, and is environmentally degrading the continent. So what they're proposing is that Africa and Africans then need to own capitalism, and therefore a capitalism with an African logic. Okay? So African values, they say, of solidarity and communal ties should be mobilized to make a case for an egalitarian, equitable, sustainable, and solidaristic capitalism, right? So the evocation of African, and in this newly minted capitalism, attempt to draw both the continent and the diaspora together. So accordingly, in certain parts of the continent, you have spaces that are advertised that you could actually live in a gated community in Africa without white people, okay? So what is interesting here is that the idea of land grab, of pushing people off land, often close to beachfronts, is not seen for what it is, a class project, alienation of land, right? But it's really an affirmation of African agency in a positive light. So the decoupling of exploitation from the essence of capitalism, because this is what Africapitalism is proposing, that exploitation is not essential to capitalism, right? So this decoupling draws on the ideas of culture, but I think in a more serious way, it also legitimizes the alienation of land, as we see in parts of West Africa, but also labor and the product of labor, such that if people are mobilizing against land grab, workers are mobilizing for higher wages. It is easy to gather a certain hegemony against them by saying that they're acting against the common interest of an Africa that needs its own capitalism to grow. And actually, these are ideas that you find in some of the publications that are coming out of the University of Edinburgh Business School in terms of to create a social consensus, to tame the insatiable desire of labor for a higher and higher share of surplus value. African societies, like societies elsewhere, are built on power relations. Inequality is intrinsic to every social formation. So what happens here is that a certain idyllic notion is called upon, that you have an African past, which is a kumbaya past, where people just love each other, there's no power relation, everything is flat. But actually, if you look at, say, the major African formations from Egypt to Mapungubwe, Kilwa, and so on, these were societies that were built on the basis of accumulating what ordinary people produce, by the ruling class. I mean, if you take Mali, for example, you had a particular understanding of mining where ordinary miners cannot keep gold bars, they can only keep the dust, because the understanding is you need a certain medium to mediate the spirits that possess the gold bar, and only those linked to the ruling classes have that medium. So this mobilization of the past, and I think this is why this is important, because it's an intellectual, it's a narrative which has been paved. You mobilize the past, create the idea of a certain past, and the notion is you want to go back to a past where people have always accumulated, but in a solidaristic way. So I think from the works and struggles of Mkandawire and the movements that he was a part of, we don't need an African capitalism, I think. I think what we need is a radical critique of every brand of capitalism. And I think I agree with Ndongo. There's simply something contradictory with the idea, about the idea of a capitalism which is also democratic. Capitalism has to be undemocratic. Capitalism needs various social cleavages to ensure accumulation. So the expansion of infrastructure where the economy is organized to feed into each other across the sub-region, these are not things that are embedded in the way in which capitalism functions. I mean, if we think of the infrastructural development in Africa under colonialism, I mean, it's a truism that, it's from the source of gold, for example, to the port. So infrastructure was not about linking polities. It was not about ensuring mobility of people. Infrastructure was about actually this extroversion of African societies. And so this idea that what you need is an infrastructural drive to pave the way for African capitalism is really another way of using notions of indigeneity to legitimize accumulation. So I think any notion of a structurally transformed economy would have to necessarily take as a condition production relations that are transformed. And this for me is the beginning, that the question of production relations, how is production organized? How is surplus value distributed? Instead of beginning with the idea of a capitalism which is African, the point is, how do we organize production? And what happens to the product, the produce that is produced? So I think scholars have a critical role to play in this at the level of ideas, as Thandika and co have done, in terms of pushing back against the epithets that were used to describe African societies. So challenging power relations becomes, I think, a crucial role of the scholar. And here it means challenging ideas that normalize power relations. So I'll quickly move to my second role, because I don't think we have much time. I'll just truncate the latter part of the paper and try and make a few comments, for my colleagues, and then we'll open up for questions. So I hope Prof. Opalo is with us. I think a very important paper, industrial policy and industrialization, I think are important issues to consider if we are really thinking of transforming fundamentally the state of our continent. So I have a couple of questions, and they center really around the conceptual framework that Professor Opalo puts forward. So the idea of ideology, says a mission-driven developmental state, and here he was talking about the immediate post-colonial moment where you had bureaucrats that were committed, or states that were committed to a project of social transformation. But my question is this, isn't this really the case that the anti-colonial struggle was not just fought around pushing the colonizers away, but it's really about undoing the fundamental character of colonialism, which is underdevelopment, okay? Which is a society where in certain parts of the continent, actually, I think it's Mozambique or Angola, less than 10 doctors, were trained at the end of colonialism. So wasn't it the case that the movement against colonialism, the decolonial movement, which was mass-based, okay, was organized around a set of demands, okay? Decolonization, of course, questions of development, but also democratizing society. So if we read it from that viewpoint, do we say that the agency lied with social mobilization? And therefore, what does that mean for us today? That if we're thinking about transformative policies around industrialization, what is the social base that can make that happen, as opposed to thinking of these as technicist questions, okay? And then the next question is around indigenization. You were talking about, questions of land reform and so on. And here I just want to cast it wide to some broader continental questions around land reform. So Sam Moyo and Paris Yeros, when they're talking about the land reform process in Zimbabwe, they considered that there was an element of elite capture. But their argument is that a certain level of democratization happened in terms of land ownership, access to land, at least by previous farm workers. Okay, so if one thinks of that question broadly at the continental level, can we say any notion of the indigenization which is outside of the class question, is not really going to the heart of the issues? Okay, so Prof. Dionne, great paper. So a couple of points. You make this point about the association between democracy and increased spending on health. And I'm wondering if there is a point at which, once you have a consensus by the major political players or political parties around the scope of policy, based on constraints imposed that you yourself admit, IMF and World Bank constraint around public spending on, say, healthcare and education. So do you get to a saturation point where democracy does not necessarily lead to an expansion in healthcare expenditure? And I'm really interested in that point that you make around Muslim societies and is it infant mortality also? I can read it briefly. Yeah. So earlier cross-national analysis finds the impact of public spending on health is quite small, while the state's income, distribution of income, female education, ethno-linguistic fractionalization, and whether it's predominantly Muslim largely explain variation in child and infant mortality. So my interest is in this largely Muslim and the ethno-linguistic fractionalization. Yeah. And finally, the point around, and this is not a question, it's just a comment, you spoke about what the HIV/AIDS pandemic did for mortality rate, but also COVID, what they did. And my point really is around, what does this tell us about the need for a strong, capable, and sovereign state, in Africa? Does that, is that also what you're saying, that the state matters, especially in these moments? And finally, Ndongo, so I want to begin from your quote of Norbert Elias. I'll read it out because I think it's important. Scientifically thinking, groups are generally groups which criticize or reject the dominant and commonly accepted ideas of their society, even when these are upheld by recognized authorities, for they have found that they do not correspond to the observable facts. In other words, scientists are destroyers of myths. So I really want to go back to the point that I made earlier in my own presentation about a radical critique of power is always important. But here it's not just power, kind of social power, which is totalizing, but also hegemonic intellectual power, through which concepts become dominant. And here, I think one of the battles that Thandika wages against the epithets that have been used to describe African societies, right? So the neo-patrimonial state, clientelism, so it's almost like epithet substitute analysis, So you just have these things and you don't have to move further. So in that regard, I want to quickly go to your point around Thandika's defense of the African state, although he was, hounded by Banda, right? And here I think it's really about intellectual integrity here. That there's a late Nigerian historian called Yusuf Bala Usman who says that the social scientist, unlike the geologist, is part of what she studies. She doesn't exist outside of it, right? So this question of bias is implicit. But I think it does not mean that her reality as a social scientist becomes the reality out there, right? And I think this for me, I think is an important lesson that Thandika is able to go beyond his experience with the African state to say, this is where my reflection lead me, counter my experience, that it's simply not autocratic, that it's contradictory, and we can do something with it. And for me, this is a lesson for all of us, that is it possible to move beyond ourselves, that the world is beyond us, that we cannot substitute our world outlook for the world as it is. And final 2 points. So you made this point about the under-theorization of imperialism in Thandika's work, and then you move on to talk about the logic of capitalism. So here I'm wondering, how would one think of structural transformation if one begins from the class question? What does structural transformation mean for a mine worker? And what does it mean for a domestic worker or for a peasant? As opposed to Tony Elumelu, they can't mean the same thing. And finally, the liberal democracy question I think is important, because I think Ayub asked an important question yesterday when Prof. Zeleza was presenting, because we just talk about democracy, right? But I mean, I think it's always important to realize that the ruling classes never conceded to democracy, right? Democracy was always qualified. Property-owning democracy at some point is what it was called. So that liberal democracy as a hemmed version of democracy can only be a tactical kind of entry point towards more substantive, or people like Wuredu will speak about consensus. Can we think of consensus building as another mode of organizing the public sphere? So I really would want to hear a bit more in terms of this notion of substantive democracy, but also not giving up. No, that's not the formulation. Thinking of liberal democracy in terms of tactical engagement, but it is simply not the destination. Thank you very much. So what I'll do is I'll call on maybe I should open up for questions and comments, and then we'll begin with Prof. Opalo. So can we start with a round of 3 questions and comments? So I see a hand here in front, and then another one. So we begin here in front, and then we go there and here.
Thank you so much, Professor, for this session.
Please introduce yourself.
I'm Mustafa Ahmed. I'm from Egypt. So actually, the title of the panel is very interesting to talk about development and the development state. And this is take me 10 years, about like 2010, when we have talking in Cairo University in some classes about what is coming first, development or democracy. And there's a dilemma of chicken and egg. And even after we move forward to development, what type of development is that we need when we talk in Africa? So sometimes we talk about development of infrastructure, sometimes we talk about social policies, sometimes we talk about economic development, but actually we always forget about something important, which is human capital. So in some countries in Asia, especially ASEAN, when they started their development, it was about we were in the same stage and we had the same, by observation, we had the same issues. Some countries, they had faced civil wars, and some of them, they had autocratics and authoritarian regimes, and maybe the situation were about same. But for them, they started and they put human capital as a center of the development in their policies. That is why those countries, like what we have mentioned, South Korea, Singapore, they become more developed, and some of them, in 2010, South Korea, they have been celebrating to be a donor or to join the donor club, from underdeveloped country to developed country. So my question is, do we need to redefine the development, the concept, or the terminology of development and the developmental state in Africa to be something as we can put human to be as a center of our policies? Because some of us might think so we do believe education is important, health is important, but if we talk about education and health in the case of Africa, we don't see it came for the purpose of human capital. It came in the purpose of having increasing of our indicators, or have to make our image in international community to be good. So we can say we end poverty, we end literacy, we end malaria, but we don't see the investor who is coming to our countries, he need a healthy and educated and well-skilled human capital in our societies or in our countries to have this kind of development. So please, we need to try to have a look on human capital and how we could redefine this concept to have or to reach for our point. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think there's a hand in the middle. No, sorry, hello.
Thanks. I wanted to probe a bit more on Ndongo's beautiful input. First of all, in terms of the interplay between the internal and external conditions that you talked about. I guess there's a kind of dialectic where, on the one hand, the external conditions play a role in shaping class formation and broader power relations within a country. And those in turn, well, in the case of a small country, are not necessarily impacting on the global conditions, but maybe the mode of articulation with that. But there are choices, there's agency, and it's evident in the heterogeneity in policies and in outcomes across countries. So I wanted just to probe more, because you spoke about the internal and external, but how you understand that dialectic and I guess the implications for space in this unipolar world, and how it connects with your own ideas about democracy. What is the kind of democracy, first of all, that you are envisaging under capitalism? Are you talking about participatory democracy or what? The kind of democracy under the ideal society. And does this immediate prospects of democracy take us further towards that? Because it might be a different thing. I just wanted to hear more of your ideas on that. Thanks.
There's one at the back. No, Majid, I'll come to you, but there's someone before.
I should go? Is it me?
Hello, my name is Gemara Mseta. I came from the University of Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. So my question revolves around the developmental state. I think developmental state was at least successful in the immediate independence period, given that at least part of the reason was the aspiration that both the societies and their government had during the time. At least the societies trusted their government to change their situation for the better. But since that situation has changed and the nature of the state-society relationship in Africa has become bad or worse, and since most of the societies do not want to have anything to do with their government, and since they are convinced most of their problems arise due to their government's maladministration or something like that. So, and because the states in Africa has proved themselves, they would rather try to do anything to stay in power rather than changing their society's situation. Do you think developmental states in Africa, in contemporary Africa, is more idealistic and unrealistic? And do you even think that African states are worth their responsibilities for such changing the situation, given their huge appetite for corruption and maladministration? Do you think it's possible for the developmental state to be successful in contemporary Africa? And my other question revolves around the capacities and the resources that African governments have. So do you find the reason for having to focus on food security and poverty as a valid reason for not focusing on health and education things, given the resources we have? It feels like African states have to focus on something because it could mean less for each sectors if we have to focus on everything, right? So do you think we have the capacity to diversify our resources for all the things we have to do? So do you think we should focus on the growth or yeah, I do think we should focus on everything and the human capital is more important, but do you think our resources makes us capable of doing that? Thank you.
Thank you. So we go to, so we'll come back for another round. Majid, I'll come
Hello?
to you. Hi, Majid. I'll come to you. Let's let's go back to the panelists and then we have another round, okay? Yeah. Prof. Opalo, please.
Thank you for all these wonderful questions and discussions, and thank you to my fellow panelists for your amazing presentations as well. I think, yes, I'll begin with the questions, the two questions about indigenization and popular mobilization. I think, I kind of share in Thandika's point on this, which was that, it's hard to develop without the people, right? So mobilization, I think, is core, popular mobilization is core to the developmental story. And I think it's very much the Asian story, right? So I know, we often like to point out how authoritarian Asian countries, East Asian countries were during the development phase. But let's discuss is how mobilized they were, right? So the idea of mass mobilization for development is very much an East Asian story. It doesn't look democratic, but it's certainly a case of the government going to the people, trying as much as possible to convince them to be better farmers or even to industrialize the countryside. So that the people came along, and along that, as part of that mobilization drive, was also the question of human capital development. So certainly the post-colonial era presented a moment where African countries could mobilize the countryside. Unfortunately, what we saw was, very deliberate demobilization. So, African political development in the 70s and 80s is basically an exercise in demobilization, where governments deliberately try to demobilize their populations to make them apolitical and basically push them outside of popular discourse. It also comes at a time when, everything gets to become technical, so that, we're listening to the experts and, forgetting more about what the people actually want. So I think to sort of remake the African developmentalist state, we necessarily have to engage in popular mobilization, which is why, I think perhaps a challenge to those of us who are interested in seeing, radical change is, and this speaks to one of the latter questions, I think too often those of us who want to see change in the African state and African societies more broadly, we're too quick to disengage and see the problem of the African state as a reason to hide from the African state, or to consider the African state as permanently damaged and therefore, unsalvageable, if I may use that word. But I'd like to challenge us here, because I think all societies that have done what we aspire to do necessarily use the state. So those of us who approach change, to the extent that we continue to cede the state to the reactionaries, right, we're unilaterally disarming ourselves. I think it's a challenge to us that if you look at the continent now, right, it's hard to point to an African government that's unabashedly progressive in the ways that many of us would like to see, right? There's a reason why Sankara is everyone's favorite, because it was a brief blip that ended prematurely. And since then, the continent is dominated by reactionaries, in part because, the progressives have basically unilaterally disarmed. And so this is a challenge for us to, embrace the tool and see the state as the tool, which Mkandawire did, right? He saw the state as a useful vehicle. Yes, it was flawed. It had, the vestiges of colonialism, but it was also a useful vehicle for mobilizing the people and trying as best we could, right? Yes, the systemic environment wasn't favorable, but we still have agency, and we could use this tool to get where we wanted to go. And lastly, I'll say that, the other challenge that the African state faced, even as, it tried to engage in developmentalism in the 60s, 70s, and in the early 80s, was this problem of extraversion, which, Grieve has written about this idea that even as African countries do developmentalism, they often look outward for validation, right? So that instead of having a domestic human capital agenda, right, they'll keep singing about SDGs, right? As if, UNICEF or the UN should be the arbiter of what states should do, right? All African countries should have their own unique human capital agendas that don't care about SDGs and whatever deadlines they have, right? So to the extent that our states are often too focused on external validation rather than internal validation, right? Regardless of whether they're autocratic or democratic, right? That's problematic because it tells us that they're not really, because they're not inwardly focused, they're not investing in making their populations legible, they don't have a full understanding of the problems they face, and therefore they're not prepared to address those problems. And so I think in a nutshell, right, the idea of the developmentalist state is not possible without having a capable tool, and a tool that's grounded in reality with all the contradictions that we've been talking about, right? I share in Thandika's optimism in the sense that it's yes, African states are trying to develop under conditions that are not ideal, but that's not a reason to give up on this state or on the project itself. But as a first step, there's a need to re-infuse, right, the right ideologies and belief systems that are needed to make this African states work. Instead of withdrawing and taking some comfort in critique from the outside, as opposed to engaging head-on to try and capture the state, as it were, and use it for good.
Okay. Thank you. Please.
Great. So, okay, it's working now. So, if I may start with your last question, is kind of the high rates of poverty and food security an excuse to not spend on health? Is there not capacity to do more than one thing at a time? I definitely think that there is capacity. I mean, if we think of these places not just as, what's their GDP per capita, but actually like what are the resources available in these states and how, and so what is the wealth that is there that maybe is not realized in these economic indicators? But I also understand the politics of it, right? And I think that certainly in a place like Malawi, I think that politicians running for election are going to campaign on these really near-term pocketbook issues, right? And I think there should be some concern about the potential for populism and just as an American, kind of seeing that happening in my own state and seeing what that's going to likely do to our civil service and to the provision of public services. I think that should be something at the forefront and when we think about this. To Mustafa's question, I just want to say, I like this idea of focusing on humans at the center. I think, and I think if we take Thandika Mkandawire's, work seriously, we can't just look at actually health indicators or education indicators, right? Because he's imploring us to really kind of think holistically about this. But frankly, it's, what does that mean, right? At the same time that he's pushing us to be, kind of empirically grounded and have, so the hard thing about this, I think, is health and education are really easy to measure, right? And part of this, and some of this is, I think, even coming out of, one of the last things that Ken was talking about with these SDGs, right? There are some things that there's reliably, consistently collected data. It may not be super credible, it may not be exact. I mean, some of the data that I showed you today, it's like, how much confidence do I have in it at every point for which there's a data point on the wall? I'm confident enough to put it on the wall, but, would I put, my life on it? No, right? But I would for health data versus, name some other social policy, right? And that's because I know that there's been a lot of investment in making sure that that data is, of good quality. So some of it is just, if we want to do something that we are confident in the empirics, it kind of makes us get small, right? And to be, and I recognize and I empathize with the fact that that's really unsatisfying. And then let me just respond a little bit, Faisal. I mean, sure, I think once there is a consensus among competing parties, right, if we just think of Ghana, once you have NHIS, right, nobody cares anymore about healthcare. I think that's true to a point, right? But the NDC and the NPP can they can blame whoever the incumbent is for the healthcare not being high quality, right? So I think, at some point, immediately with the return to multi-party competition, we start to see universal primary education. Oh, they're going to do that. Well, we're going to say universal secondary education. It's like, oh, well, we're going to institute a national health insurance scheme, right? So I think that there are these kind of redistributive universal benefits that we'll see more likely in, I don't want to call them democracies, even though that's kind of what the political science literature was saying. I would say in places where there's competitive electoral contests, right? Because for me, democracy means more than that. But we will see that it's a little bit harder to campaign on the quality of public services. You do see some of that, I mean, in Ghana, but elsewhere too. And I think then it becomes harder. And it's dependent on a really strong kind of media and also civic education to be able to make policy claims. There's other questions, but I'm going to turn over time.
Thank you for the questions, the contributions. I have been some questions about democracy, development. In fact, I wrote a book on democracy. In fact, on the story of the word democracy, published, I think, in 2014. I spent 5 years just trying to answer that question. What's the meaning of democracy? And I have read, all the major books in philosophy, political theory in the West, from the book of Herodotus, because the concept of democracy first appeared in the book by Herodotus called Histories. And the funny thing is that the term appeared when, in fact, Herodotus was describing a dialogue between Persian revolutionaries discussing what is the best form of government. And that's why Herodotus has never been taken seriously by the West, because he was implying that the West did not invent democracy, you see. And I have read the dot literature from Herodotus to the collective works of Abraham Lincoln, just to understand why. Because Abraham Lincoln had this famous quote, the government of the people, by the people, for the people, etc. And the major finding was from the 60th BC until the mid-19th century, there is no political thinker that describes democracy as a good government. There is none. Because democracy was born as an insult. Demos kratos. Demos was not the whole population, but the poor citizens. That means those who have political rights, so the women were excluded, the strangers, the foreigners, and also the slaves, and those who were poor. And people like Aristotle, Plato, and all the traditional Western political philosophy, they hated that system. They say, oh, it's not natural that the ordinary citizens should make laws because these people are not educated. Why should they do that? So they hated democracy for 2,000 years, more than that. And when we had the American Revolution, the French Revolution, those who created this system we now call liberal democracy, they said, we don't like democracy. So how could we prevent, democracy as government of the people by the people themselves? And that was a project of the American founding fathers. That's why when you would look at the dictionaries, for example, you look at the French dictionary, in the 19th century, you go to democracy, the definition was subdivision of tyranny between many citizens. You go to Google, you look at the American Constitution, you will find no trace of the word democracy and democratic, because these were designed against democracy. And they called the system republic, aristocratic, elective aristocracy. So that's why when I hear people talking about democracy by democracy, this is not consistent, from just a historical and linguistic perspective. And there have been important authors like Luciano Canfora, the Italian, philologist, John Donne, Francis Dupuytren, who also did that work. So the modern concept of democracy is totally fraudulent. So when people use that to do econometric work, etc., it's problematic. But still, I am committed to the idea of democracy, but the original idea, because you have two concepts, isonomia and isegoria. Political equality means we have the equal chance to be part of the sovereign process, to make laws and to control, how the city is run. That is the idea of democracy, and that is something beautiful. Now we live in the modern period, so we have to see democracy as an input and as an outcome. Input to say it's not just participation, you go to elect people, because elections literally share the same root as elites. The elections are the procedure you use to create an elite. So elections could never be democratic. And for more than 2 millennia, there is no political thinker who ever wrote about democratic elections. This has been invented after the 19th century, you see. People used to associate democracy with lot, because lot makes sure that all the citizens, they could be part of sovereign bodies. And there are many things we could do with lot. You see, you take, for example, there is a very interesting project called Cost of Politics. You look at the study on Liberia. The GDP per capita of Liberia is something like $800 US. But to have the chance to be elected at the parliament in Liberia, you should spend at least $250,000 US to be elected. Which kind of elections are these? These people will never defend their people. And these are the kind of structures we have. And why should these people be in the parliament? What is their title to govern? Most of us, we could be member of parliaments. A lot could do that. But what I would like to say is that we have to problematize first the whole idea of democracy, because the modern political language, as George Orwell said, is totally fraudulent. But now, in Africa, we have urgent needs, very urgent needs. For example, when I see how young people taking boats, makeshift boats, to try to reach the Mediterranean, and we have no solution for them, it's a problem. We could not just say to them, we are waiting for economic growth or structural transformation. Because these young people, I live in Senegal, we have been a democracy for, there are even people saying that since 1789, because we sent some claims at the French, assembly, we have been democracies. And we have not developed. Every day, people are trying, to join Europe, and they will die. So we need to have some kind of, other ways of, organizing the economy. And this is possible. This is possible. Simply, we have to think differently. I'm not saying that we are all constrained, etc. There is still the agency. There are many things we could do. But if we don't understand, the constraints of the current system, we could not exit out of it. But we have to understand that.
Okay. Thank you very much. I really feel very bad now, because I promised Majid that I'll come to him. Thank you very much, Majid. That's really generous of you. So please, another round of applause for the panelists. So I hope we will carry this conversation about democracy to the tea break. The 1968 movement of students had the slogan, be realistic, and then they end by saying, try the impossible. So thank you.